Report. Joining us now is Nikolai Petrovsky. He's an expert in vaccines and part of a group of scientists calling for a new investigation into the origins of coronavirus. Also with us, CNN political analyst Josh Rogin, who has done a lot of reporting on the pandemic's origins. Gentlemen, let me just start by saying what a remarkable documentary that was last night. I mean, one more thing I should say, Josh, you're the author of the new book, Chaos Under Heaven, America, China, and the Battle for the 21st Century. So this documentary last night, I mean, I think that, Nikolai, it's so rare that so soon after a catastrophe, or in this case, in the middle of an ongoing catastrophe, you get access to the top 6 government health officials who are yearning to talk. I mean, there was a feeling of them sort of pulling off their muzzles now, being out of the administration and wanting to tell the story of what had happened. And Sanjay Gupta just asked the most incisive questions. It was riveting to hear from them. And so I just want to recap Dr. Deborah Birx. I mean, she said something that has garnered so much attention, which is, yes, the first 100,000 American deaths when we didn't know what was happening, didn't know what this novel coronavirus was doing, those were always going to be a tragedy. But after that, her feeling is the losses that we now see on the right side of your screen didn't have to happen. So here she is saying it again.
Well, I look at it this way. The first time we have an excuse, there were about 100,000 deaths that came from that original surge. All of the rest of them, in my mind, could have been mitigated or decreased substantially if we took the lessons we had learned from that moment. That's what bothers me every day.
Nikolai, what were your thoughts listening to that?
Look, I couldn't agree more. I mean, in Australia, we similarly had an early surge with just under 1,000 deaths. We learned the lessons. You know, we closed the borders. We started testing on an enormous scale, and we've not really had any deaths since in the last 6 months. You know, we capped it at that first 1,000 during that first few months. So it's really unfortunate to see other countries that we thought would do better obviously, you know, not achieve that, and we have to ask why and what can be done better next time.
Josh, you've done a lot of reporting on the Wuhan lab, and Dr. Redfield told Sanjay Gupta from CNN that he really does believe, by instinct, if not direct evidence, that the Wuhan lab could be the logical place this began. Now, the WHO report, going to be released yesterday, as you heard Nick Payton-Walsh just say, seems to say that is not likely at all. Now, what is your degree of skepticism about that conclusion, apparently, from the upcoming WHO report?
I have a lot of skepticism about the WHO report, but it's not just me. Secretary of State Antony Blinken told CNN's Dana Bash yesterday on State of the Union that the U.S. government, the Biden administration, has real concerns about the WHO investigations process and methodology, in part because apparently the Chinese government helped to write the report. That's not me. That's Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing is that, you know, these scientists, some of the investigators, already ruled out the lab accident theory before they even started the investigation. That reveals their bias. And by the way, they also have direct conflicts of interest because they worked directly with the WIV scientists for years and years and years and funded their projects. And also they didn't actually investigate the lab accident theory. And now they're concluding, oh, well, we shouldn't look at it anymore. So I think if all you have to do is listen to Robert Redfield, who is not just talking on his instinct, he has seen the intelligence. He can't tell us what he's seen. He's not allowed to disclose it, but he's seen it, okay? That means it exists. That means the Biden administration should release what they know. And what Robert Redfield is saying very clearly here is there is a lot of evidence pointing to more investigation, not that we know, not that there's proof, but that we need investigation of all the theories, including the lab accident theory, including the natural spillover theory, and we just can't rely on the WHO investigation. It's sad, but it's true.
Let's play that one more time, what Dr. Redfield said last night.
You know, I am of the point of view that I still think the most likely etiology of this pathogen in Wuhan was from a laboratory, you know, escaped. Other people don't believe that. That's fine. Science will eventually figure it out. I do not believe this somehow came from a bat to a human, and at that moment in time, the virus that came to the human became one of the most infectious viruses that we know in humanity. for human-to-human transmission.
Nikolai, he points out he doesn't have evidence to present at the moment, but that it stands to reason. And he had a whole, I mean, this is what he does, much like you. He had a whole set of list of circumstantial reasons that he thinks it. For instance, not unusual, he said, for a pathogen to infect a lab worker. I mean, it has happened. We've seen that in the past.
Absolutely. Look, when people talk about no evidence, you could argue there's no evidence on either side. There's a lot of talk about intermediate hosts, and Peter Daszak, obviously has really been pushing that very hard. There is no intermediate host. No one has found a single animal that would qualify as an intermediate host, despite desperately looking for those animals. So I think on the side of the lab leak hypothesis, there is considerable data that suggests, as Robert mentioned, this virus is quite unusual for a pandemic virus. And our own research showed that really it was perfectly adapted to infect and transmit between humans from the very first case. And that is not normally a feature of a pandemic virus. Normally it takes a while for them to learn the tricks of how to get around and how to spread between inside a new human host. So, there is evidence of unusual features about this virus. Of course, no single piece of evidence can identify where it came from. But I think there's as much evidence for the potential lab leak hypothesis as there currently is for a natural, animal crossover event. So I think we have to be fair and say it's a completely open question, and good science is not always good politics. If we want to keep the Chinese happy, then we have to actually ignore one possibility and only investigate the other. That makes it very difficult to do good science.
One of the things that is clear is that China's lack of transparency at the outset compounded this global health crisis. I want to play a sound from Dr. Fauci from last night, and then Josh, come to you.
How much did you trust the information coming out of China initially?
I always had skepticism about it because of what we went through with SARS. People forget, but in SARS, the Chinese were saying, oh, it's flu. And then the next thing you know, that SARS was all over the world, in Canada and Australia, all over the place. So they are not very transparent in the past. It wasn't outright lying, they just didn't give you all the information.
How big a difference would it have been if our own investigators had been on the ground in China?
I think it would have been a significant difference.
Now, Josh, your book delves deeply into the lack of transparency with regards to China. As we look forward to the release of this report, it looks like a lot of the emphasis is being put on this intermediate animal, sort of blaming the pangolin theory. What are you going to be looking for? You heard Nick Payton Walsh say one of the things that may be discussed is this idea that it was passed along on frozen food. Is there any evidence for that kind of a transmission as a credible explanation for how this spread worldwide?
Right. If you set aside the origin question, it's obvious and clear, as Fauci just said, that Chinese government actions, including the hiding of information and the suppression of science and journalism in those early days, cost lives. Lots of lives. And it wasn't the only thing. As Sanjay Gupta laid out, there were several failures that caused us to get to the situation we're in. But the Chinese government continues to cover up that science and to withhold that data. And that's an ongoing problem. Now, the WHO investigation, if they want to go to Norway and look through frozen fish packages to try to find the virus, they're welcome to do that. Okay, and if they find it, and then mea culpa, good for them. Okay, but meanwhile, somebody should investigate this lab accident theory for real. Okay, and they're not going to do it. So they can go look for the frozen food packages. Someone else has got to go look for this lab accident theory. And guess what? The Chinese government's not going to like that.
Josh Rogin, Nikolai Petrovsky, thank you both very much for all of your expertise.